So inflation has probably been the biggest, often in the UK, there's a thing where they do the word of the year. And basically, inflation will have been on every news channel every day, probably for the past 6, 7 months. And at the moment, I think hopefully we've peaked, but the cost of living, the cost of everything that we buy has just gone up dramatically. The inflation is impacted as an overall figure based on the cost of different things going up and down, and actually how that impacts user and spender behavior on different stuff. The big driver has been energy. So with the war in Ukraine, basically energy prices really spiked and went through the roof, and that has been a huge thing on petrol for your car, but your heating for your house. And especially at the moment in the UK, we've had -5, -7 temperatures recently here, which is rare. That's not a common thing. But what you've got is the compounded cost of living on heating bills with a really cold period in Christmas. And again, that time of the year, again, with Christmas, there's extra pressures and stuff, which I'm going to talk about. But it's the worst possible time that it could have possibly happened. But what I wanted to do was actually talk about inflation from an employer's perspective, because often on social media and also on the news, it's about, we have a lot of strikes at the moment here in the UK. So I don't want to go into the rights and wrongs about should people strike to fight for what they think they deserve, which I understand. I genuinely trying to understand different viewpoints. But I just wanted to explain from the employer's point of view, things to consider, because it's not always obvious. And then likewise, the more you work in business, but likewise, the higher up the tree you are in different organizations, these are genuine, real considerations and things that you have to think about. That just this week and last week, with some of the companies that I work with as a management consultant, we've been looking at cost of living, pay rises and different things. But it's really difficult to figure out what can you afford to do, because if you can't afford to keep up the higher level of wage, etc., you can go bust if you run out of money. So it's a really difficult one to think about. So the first thing for most employers, so what I'm going to do is talk about this from a commercial sector. So not the public sector, which is different, which is funded by the government, which is therefore funded by taxpayers, but just in a commercial industry. So I'm going to use, say, offshore energy, which is my kind of background. So most companies work as something called a supply chain. So what you have is that you have the end client at the top. So in the automotive industry, it could be Nissan that make cars, or an offshore energy. It could be the oil and gas company who develop the project, which then goes on to make energy. But the point is, most companies actually sit as part of a supply chain. So when things like inflation start to hit, there's always a lag between when things start to change and interest rates start to go up and cost of borrowing, and it gets actually really complicated. But there's a certain point where if you run a company, especially if it's a manufacturing company where you buy in a lot of stuff, often your profit margins aren't massive, but the cost of everything you need to buy goes up. So what I'm going to do is basically draw a bit of a graph and hopefully try and explain it. But essentially, when you have a business and you're as part of a supply chain, the obvious answer in theory was, well, why don't we just put our prices up? But the challenge is, if you're part of a competitive supply chain with lots of options, if you put your prices up today and someone else, a competitor, does not, and they might do it in 2 months' time, you're going to lose a lot of business. And a lot of people genuinely worry about, actually, if I put the price up, will my amount of business go down? And although this sounds silly, it's a genuine consideration, because people know, and they get scared about charging their customers more because they worry about losing the business. And it's the lifeblood, it's everything that you kind of live off. But the truth is, you end up getting squeezed. So I just want to kind of draw this out to hopefully explain it. So what I'm going to do is very crudely try and explain revenue, gross profit, direct costs, indirect costs, and actually how the cost of inflation really kind of squeezes employers. So the first one, the amount of stuff that you sell is generally classed as your revenue. I think people kind of explain that and they understand that. So that if you sell iPhones and they sell for £1,000 each, if you sell 100,000 iPhones, that's £10 million. But you get the point that you have your very high level revenue sales figure. Underneath that, basically you'll have your direct costs. So basically your direct costs are the stuff that are basically directly linked to the production of each unit cost of product. So to make this particular phone, you've got all the components that go into it, you've got all the labor that goes into it, and then depending on how people do their accounting, they might actually link in more stuff to do with that. But generally, it's the cost to actually make each unit of kind of product. So based on that, what you have is that you might sell it for £1,000, but it might cost you, I don't know, £800 to make. So actually what you have above here is your gross profit. So that's when you sell each thing. Underneath that and sat behind the business, you will have office space, insurance, staff, and these are all things called overheads. So your overheads sit there. And what that does, the important thing with any business is actually to work out your net profit. So this is the amount of profit that you make after you've done everything, which is the whole point why you're in business. So you might sell stuff for £1,000, but actually if £800 of it was actually to make the materials to actually make the stuff, then you've got loads of overheads for the billing, the people and everything else. You might need to sell, I don't know, 1 million iPhones just to break even, because otherwise you're still losing money. But then the business as a whole, by the time you actually get to the end of the year, will hopefully have some net profit left. And not everyone does. This is a really important thing to keep in mind, that you can actually run a business that sells 1 million units a year and still lose a ton of money. And the reason why that can often happen is that even if you sell each unit product at a profit, you might not sell enough of those products, or even if you do, there's something called payment terms, which we've talked about in the before, which actually is when if you sell B2B, so you might sell your bulk unit of 100,000 iPhones to a retailer to then sell on to someone else. They might not pay you for 90 or 120 days, which might mean that you might sell a ton of iPhones and everything's fantastic, but you have to pay your suppliers. And basically, if you don't get paid before you need to pay someone else, you will gradually run out of cash, which is really bad. I've spoken about that on a previous kind of topic, so I won't cover that today. But today is about inflation and why, from an employer's perspective, it's really important. So within this, keep it in mind, so basically with inflation, the cost of everything goes up. So the cost of your direct costs goes up and erodes into your gross profit margin. And this is that if all of the costs of all the bits goes up and suddenly that it costs you £900 to make the iPhone, not £1,000, your gross profit's been squeezed. But then likewise, you're also getting squeezed at the other end, because if your overheads go up, so the cost of your electricity, your building, your rent, your people, your staff, whichever. And actually what often happens is that basically companies get squeezed to the point where they're not making any money. So the challenge that you have is that in a manufacturing business, it might not be, well, I'd say it's fairly common that you might make 30 to 40% gross margin, which is here. So, you do quite well per unit, but actually based on the amount of sales and stuff that they have, they might only make, I don't know, 6-10% actually net profit on the whole business operation. But the issue is if through cost of inflation and everything else, that all of your costs go up 8 to 10%, it's then actually pushed you into a negative. And the issue you've got is that if you then are losing money, for one, there's no point being in business, but you will very quickly go bust. And the issue is, as an employer, is that then the whole thing goes under. You might be layered with tons of debt through basically just borrowing and stuff that you've kind of done. But also probably all your staff will lose their jobs. And one of the things that's really challenging, and genuinely I've had this decision this week and last week, and this is what my day job is that when we look at cost of living increases for different members of the team, genuinely, how can we afford it? Because you can't risk the business, you can't risk the whole ship basically on just giving 10-20% pay rises, because actually then that just torpedoes the whole thing, and basically lots of people will lose their jobs and there'll be lots of pain. And the way I often try and describe it, it's like picking your poison. It's a case of what thing do you pick which is going to hurt you? They're all going to hurt you. That yes, with all this in mind, you can just put your prices up. But as I said at the start, if a competitor, either they might have a ton of cash in the bank, they might have a different backer that can fund through the period. But so, especially for a small independent business that doesn't have venture capital finance and stuff, it's really, really difficult. And the reason why this is really important is that the environment as a whole is really tough for everyone at the moment. I'm going to talk about it later, but almost the cost of living for people is huge, and I get that, and I really understand that. But also for businesses, yes, there will be some businesses that make a shed ton of profit, maybe based on what they do, in which case it's less of an issue, and they absolutely 100% should do what they can to pay. But especially in a tight margin manufacturing type environment, it's really tough to do. At the moment, we have strikes in the postal service here in the UK. We have rail strikes, some of our healthcare workers. And it's a really tough one because in these rail union strikes at the moment, basically they offered a pay rise. I think it was give or take 6%, might have been more. The unions rejected it, saying, no, we want 10, but actually we want to protect all the jobs as well. But the issue is, and one of the comments from the the rail company bosses is that we can offer the 6%, but actually we need to get leaner, more efficient as a business to reduce their overhead so that they can actually operate at the level to just survive in the new environment that they find themselves in. But part of the challenge with the unions is that the unions are not accepting that argument because they don't want to lose jobs. But the issue is asking for a pay rise and refusing to modernize and that kind of thing is saying they want the best of both worlds, where they want to keep the massive overhead, increase it, and they don't care that actually if it makes any money or not. And this is the challenge that often goes on across for employers, that, you know, if you're in a job, I completely respect your need and desire to do whatever it is that you need and want to do to look after yourself. I completely get that. But what I wanted to do is just talk about from an employer's perspective. It's not always as easy as you think. It's not about greed. You have a huge percentage of the UK's businesses are small to medium-sized businesses owned by real people that genuinely love their team, but they still have to worry about actually how do they make the business survive next year, survive the year after, to then help, you know, give people a better life for themselves as well. So my name's Steve Pugh. This is just a quick topic that we wanted to cover for YouTube and LinkedIn and lots of other kind of stuff. We have a business course called the Roadmap MBA, and if you want to check it out, it's completely free. Go to roadmapmba.com.